Namaskar and welcome to this exciting episode of Sathology Debunking Mythology. Sathology means science of truth or study of truth. Opposite of that is mythology, which means science or study of fake, lie, or imagination. So we have been doing many shows, and I thank you really for loving our shows. I have a very special guest today, introduced by a common friend, Ratan Sharda, who is an author of 11 books and numerous articles and TV shows all over India. So without delay, let us welcome from Australia, an American from Australia, Salvatore Babones. Welcome, Salvatore.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I was following your trip to India, and I was following your interviews all over India, and pretty successful trip. So what brought you? What was the interest that you were traveling, or you were so much interested in Indian history, ancient history, and coming from Australia?
That was actually my first ever trip to India, and I was in India as a guest of India Today. I was invited to attend the India Today conclave in Mumbai. They invited me because I had written a paper in August, actually timed for the 75th anniversary of Indian statehood. I'd written a paper on India's international democracy rankings. The three major democracy ranking systems all rate India very poorly, and in fact, the most academic, most scientific of the systems rates India the very worst, at 101st in the world for the quality of its democracy. And in fact, they say India is not a democracy at all, that it's an electoral autocracy is their term for it, akin to Russia, for example. I thought this was ludicrous. As someone who's been studying Indian democracy for 2 to 3 years now, I'm researching a book on the subject. I just thought these rankings were absolutely wrong. Coming from a background in quantitative macro-comparative sociology, where my own specialty as a statistician is indices and making international comparisons, I thought I really had to write something, on the side, that is on the side of my book research. I really had to write something about these democracy rankings. That paper on the democracy rankings was published in an Australian magazine called Quadrant Magazine. It later went viral in India. It was reprinted by The Print, the Indian news organization run by Shekhar Gupta. And I was invited by India Today to come have an interview with Rajdeep Sardesai at the India Today conclave in Mumbai. And so I took the opportunity to go. But the fact is, I don't have a long-standing interest in Indian culture or society. I'm, maybe reasonably well informed on Indian history, but I came to India through the study of Indian democracy as an exceptional case of a successful democracy in a poor country. I didn't come to India from a deep cultural knowledge of the country.
I saw your interviews, I heard your interviews, and you seem to be pretty well informed based on a theoretical study and what you have done. You are a statistician and you wrote a paper on democracy. And we all know that Aristotle actually abhorred democracy. Athenian democracy was the one who killed Plato and Socrates. So he did not like democracy word. And Americans nowadays, I'm seeing a new fashion in the campuses here, is that constitutional republic is the one they prefer to use. And constitutional republic is pretty much autocratic in many ways. It cannot be democratic. There is America has a very good democratic system on the ground, very well, and you are from here. So why this kind of people are moving to constitutional republic or calling the largest democracy on the world real democracy, very wild democracy, India, and in such ways?
Well, as you indicated in the setup to your question, the intellectual vilification of democracy or just distaste for democracy is not something new. It goes back 2,500 years and probably earlier than that. It goes right back to Aristotle, who called democracy a degenerate form of government. Or if you read Plato's Republic, it's all about setting up an ideal republic in which there is no democracy. Instead, there is a self-perpetuating class of guardians. And interestingly, Plato's guardian class are people who, the philosophers essentially, who run society, whose own children then are supposed to run society after them. So it's a biologically self-perpetuating class. That is, guardians expect their own children to grow up to be guardians, but with some social mobility, in that especially talented members of the rest of society could be admitted to this guardian class over time. And I think that model of having a group of guardians who run society for us is, in many ways, has been the ideal model of the majority of intellectuals, going right forward till today. I mean, even people who we think were writing about democracy, for example, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. If you read Rousseau on the Social Contract, he doesn't advocate democracy. In fact, he advocates the opposite. He says that democracy is not how you ascertain the popular will. In order to ascertain the popular will, you have to be an intellectual who studies the popular will. So this idea that that experts can better administer society than ordinary people is really of long heritage. The problem for that expert class is that since World War I, and especially since World War II, the prestige of the word democracy has risen to such an extent that since 1945, it has been disreputable to question democracy. Now, if you go back before 1945, especially before 1920, you can find lots of academic political scientists, lots of academic experts who don't think that democracy is a very good form of governance, and who think that democracy needs limits, or needs to have the adults in the room to be in charge to make sure it doesn't do incorrect things. And I want to be clear, from a policy standpoint, they may be right. I mean, Athenian democracy had no buffers, and it did terrible things. It twice voted to commit genocide. So I don't think it's necessarily true that democracies will always do good things. But I think it has been a long-standing feature of intellectual opposition to democracy that intellectuals generally feel that they should be in charge. And that is a fundamentally anti-democratic view of the world that doesn't square easily with our current day worship of the term democracy.
The one interesting thing comes out that most of the American policymakers, we talk to a lot of them here, they prefer to call themselves constitutional republic. But as a State Department exports, democracy is the biggest export of the United States. I mean, the United States has exported to India as well in many ways. And India adopted a constitution which was a mix of United States Constitution and many other constitutions combined. Like, you can say that it's a hodgepodge of all the constitutions with Indian values, and probably the largest constitution in the world today. Now, one question comes in the mind, like in 1908, when the European settlers became more in numbers than the Native American population of the first 13 states of the United States. At that time, there was a papal bull which said that, and you can verify it, it's available as a public record, that it said that now since the European settlers are more in number, and now the voting rights can be given to Native Americans. But it was until 1924 where Native Americans were officially given the citizenship of the United States. It took them approximately 16 years for that. So that is the history of democracy in the United States. And after that, you have all the frontier wars happen, and the US was moved from Oklahoma, then came to the West, and all those things happened. So this is the history of democracy here. Now, coming to the history of democracy in Australia, you know very well about, I must commend Australian government also, because they have done a good work in absorbing Aborigines in the parliamentary process. They've done some work. Other countries have not done it. United States has not done it. There is only one sitting congressman, and I think probably he's also gone. So there's only one representing Native Americans here. So in the case of Native populations, when you see how much democracies all over the world has been successful in integrating them?
Look, there are a lot of assumptions in that very long question you've just asked, and let me go through some of them. First, this rhetoric around a constitutional republic is very ahistorical. It just doesn't recognize the history of American democracy. If you go right back to John Adams, who wrote in the 1780s about the constitutions of the United States, meaning the state constitutions, each of the 13 original states was itself democratic. So whether or not the federal government was a democracy or was a republic or was, federation, certainly there's been a shift over time from thinking of the federal government as more a federation of independent states to being a unified democratic country of its own. And we saw that with, for example, the progressive reform movement in the 1890s and 1900s that led to the popular election of senators. In the original Constitution, senators were the representatives of the state legislatures in Washington. They were not the representatives of the people of the states in Washington. So we've seen that slow transition in the U.S. from an alliance of 13 colonies under the Articles of Confederation to being a unified national democracy that we have today in the United States. And I think it's disingenuous to call the U.S. anything but a democracy. As far as the integration of Native Americans and Native Australians go, again, there's a lot of ahistorical or lack of historical knowledge involved with that. Native Americans have always been allowed to vote in the U.S. if they are resident in the community that's voting. So remember, you vote in a community. You don't just vote as a citizen of the U.S. Native Americans who were living outside of the political community of the United States, of course, did not vote. But as far as I'm aware, and there may be individual state laws of which I'm not aware, but certainly in the northeastern United States, as far as I'm aware, Native Americans who were settled in the community in the northeastern U.S. were allowed to vote right from the beginning. I'm sorry, not literally the beginning, from the beginning of the United States. So from the 1780s. And it's the same story in Australia. In Australia, there are records of Aboriginal Australians voting going all the way back to the early 19th century, but only voting if they were settled in the communities that were holding the votes. So back in 1805, when the European settlement of Australia was a thin strip along the coast, you wouldn't expect an uncontacted native Australian living in the outback who's never met a European to be voting in the local Sydney elections. Now, this is just a matter of defining what is the community. In settler colony states like Australia, like the United States, the community has expanded over the centuries from being a small community of European settlers to being a continental community embracing everyone who lives within inside the political borders. That has happened in Australia. It's happened in the United States. But I think the level of political exclusion of indigenous peoples has been extraordinarily exaggerated. Now, the U.S., of course, has its own problems with slavery, and that's a whole separate issue. But focusing specifically on indigenous peoples, really, I think the exclusion of indigenous peoples from the political community is something that has been really overplayed. In the past, the question was, should they have their own institutions outside the institutions of the state? And once it became, practically speaking, clear, for instance, in the United States after 1890, with the closing of the frontier in the United States, as it was called, well, Native American people were no longer independent countries having treaties with the U.S. from outside it. By the time the frontier was closed, Native American people were part of the American society. And once they became part of American society, they very quickly began to vote in American elections.
So one question comes in, like when we talk about democracy and a lot of debate going on in the United States, you must be observing it also, that America doesn't have a democracy now, USA doesn't have, we're fighting for the democracy. A lot of political slogans go out. Sure. One thing is there, like, for example, reservations. Now, most of the reservations are big, and post boxes are not accepted as a formal address for voting. That is a US law. Register of Voters, that's what they maintain it. And
well, because voting is based on residence. You have to have a residence in order to vote. That's why I don't vote. I don't have a residence in the US.
Correct. And the PO boxes are almost like 15 miles away from the homes, like inside if you go, sure, 15, 20 miles, and it's mostly cannot go. And I think that's the reason also why most of the Native Americans cannot vote, most of them. Now, changing the topics a little bit here. Now, in the democratic world, since you studied the democracies of all over the world, now, in the European context, the populations are mostly homogeneous, like one culture, one language. Or
I think we tend to exaggerate that, but
yeah,
that's the stylized fact. Yes.
so yeah, it's a similar cultures, like slight variations. Italian can easily understand Spanish. They can understand French. They may have difficulty in understanding, but generally it's similar type of language backgrounds. Now coming to United States, we have English speaking people, Spanish speaking people, and local indigenous. Other communities are also there. Now, when it comes to India, India has a one culture, is a predominant one culture, but a big historical background of Lokatantra. Lokatantra is the word of India, which is not democracy in true sense of the word. And India has maintained those traditions from the times of Mahabharata and other things, places. So the majority minority concept in democracy, or the left or the right context in a democracy, doesn't really work in a multicultural society. Now, what is your opinion on that?
There are a lot of stylized historical facts in what you've just said that I think, as academics, we really need to question. So, for example, the idea that each European state is somehow a homogeneous ethnic state. Those homogeneous ethnic states were only created through processes of homogenization, which is to say, if you go back to the creation of the modern state of Italy in the 1860s, Italy was not a homogeneous state, right? There were dialects that were virtually unintelligible to each other. There were places that it was unclear whether they should be Italian or Croatian, Italian or French. That homogenization occurred through the school system over a period of a century or more. And now that homogenization is being challenged once again by immigration. And it's not just Italy. Take any European country. If we look at the history more closely, you'll find that it only became a homogeneous, quote unquote, ethno-state through previous processes of what were at the time considered liberal reforms. So now ethno-nationalism is considered a dirty word by liberals, yet the construction of uniform ethnic national states in Europe was a liberal reform of the 19th and early 20th centuries, reflected ultimately in Woodrow Wilson, the great liberal internationalist, racist at home, liberal internationalist abroad, Woodrow Wilson promising self-determination for each of the peoples of Europe. All of that based on an ethno-nationalist idea of what a state should be. So it's quite ironic that the liberal reforms of 100 years ago are now vilified as arch-conservative viewpoints today, but that's history for you. Now in India, we see the same sort of processes the same sort of conflicts that arose in Europe. So in India, we may have the idea that each state of India is somehow uniform, but of course you're very aware that within states in India, there is a lot of disagreement about what exactly the linguistic and ethnic heritage of that state is, what the history of that state is. History wars exist everywhere because histories ultimately determine what we tell our children about who they are. We tell them the story in school of who they are. So the construction of India as a civilization that's been a single civilizational zone for time immemorial, since the Mahabharata, well, that's one story of India. It's not the only possible story you could tell of India, since, of course, from that story, I would have to include all of Southeast Asia in India. Because they were all part of this Indic civilization before the Muslim invasions of the, what was it, 12th, 13th, 14th century, the Muslim invasions of Southeast Asia. So, we all choose our histories to serve some kind of identitarian purpose. And I don't mean that in a negative way. Everyone needs an identity. That is, those who oppose the idea of an Indic civilization definition of India also cherry pick history to choose their own preferred identity for their own preferred area of India or their own preferred vision of what India should be. These quote unquote history wars, that really is the right term for it, I think are healthy for democracy. We have to have these debates because the truth is history is much messier than any of us really want to acknowledge. But someone has to teach history in school. How are we going to determine how we teach history in school? Well, ultimately, in a democracy, we have to have the discussion and then have a democratic consensus around who we are as countries.
You brought in a very interesting point about someone has to teach history, and history defines identity. Like it's the brain wiring, the way the brains are wired. Languages wire the brains. So, like if you look at the
Sure.
Sanskrit-based languages, where the entire grammatical reference changes. Like in English, what it is exactly reverse. Sanskrit is more close to Latin in terms of grammatical constructs, because Latin is said to be coming from Sanskrit. So the question comes in now
Well,
because
and Sanskrit is probably, I'm not a linguist, is probably closer to Latin than it is to Tamil. Yet no one would question that Tamil and Hindi India have much more of a shared historical experience than
um,
Hindi speaking India has with Italy.
see, the thing is, in India, one thing is there. Like if you look at Tamil language was also invented by Agastya Muni. Agastya Muni is the one very famous rishi in Ramayana. He's the one who invented Tamil language, and he was Sanskritist also. He was speaking Sanskrit. So same people have invented multiple languages. Most of Tamils may not agree with me, but I have documented proofs of that. So the question is comes in like because the brain is wired in a different way. And you very accurately mentioned that everybody needs to be told history. Now, if you look at the traditional schools of the world, India has many gurukuls. You must be aware of that. Many traditional schools there.
Sure.
History is subject which is values are taught from Ramayana, Mahabharata, but history is not taught. The reason for that is because history is relative. My version of history may be different. Your version of history may be different. European version of history may be completely different. So, but when you impose a one set of history ideals on others, then it becomes a problem. That's where the conflict starts, and arguments also start from there. So, I like your point over there. So, my question to you is that when we are talking about the global history, especially from in the context of democracies, now there cannot be one version of history all over the world. There has to be a version coming from Egyptians. A lot of Egyptians watch our show. Egyptians coming from Egyptians, from Europeans, from Arabs, and from Indians. And then each one of them is giving their version of history to relate to the rest of the world, because that's a vehicle for relationship. So, how do you see that the current academic system, especially in the US, I see is so much Europeanized history? So much of, I have read the textbooks of Ziegler. I don't know whether they teach them in Australia right now or not. Ziegler is a 10th grade textbook. My kids go through that. It's abominable. Like if a Native American reads that book, he says, "Oh my gosh," it's still the settler mindset is talking over there. So, what do you think needs to be done to change this kind of homogenization, which is still going on?
Well, there's going to be homogenization no matter what you do. The question is it a homogenization you agree with or not? And that's what history wars are really all about. Look, from an academic intellectual standpoint, I think most academic intellectuals would like to recognize that history is incredibly messy and there is no one authoritative story of how a community came to exist. That said, democracy relies on people accepting as second nature without even questioning it. They simply accept majority rule. And you only accept majority rule if you feel you're part of a community, that the community votes and you're willing to accept that people in a different part of your country can vote for something that affects you. Well, but we all accept it because we all accept we're part of a single community. Multinational democracies historically have simply not succeeded. It has been it's always been a serious fault line that results in endless pressure for breakup, precisely because if people view themselves as belonging to multiple national communities within the same geography, they are not willing to accept majority rule if majority rule means that one community outvotes them. People have to feel like they're all part of the same community. So the question is, what is the history of the community as it exists? So Australia is a democratic country. It has a single democratic polity. And the question for Australians is, what history do they want their history to be? Institutionally, clearly, the history of Australia is the history of British settlement. I mean, Australia's institutions no matter what you might want to say about indigenous ceremonies that may be similar to some forms of court proceedings in today's Australia, the judge is there with a white wig on, being called, milord. It's an English institutional system. However, the physical landscape is unambiguously indigenous. Right? So the physical landscape clearly comes from the heritage of indigenous Australia. And then, of course, there also is multicultural Australia. Most people in Australia are neither of English nor indigenous descent. And in the US, in Australia, it's very close at this point. It'll soon be true that most are not English. In the United States, it's very obvious. American institutions may derive from English institutions, but most Americans are not of English descent. So what's your history? In the US, the answer has been pretty much, American history starts, there are a few chapters on the Pilgrims and the colonies, but, American history starts 1776 and boom, it's America. And we move forward from there. Everything before that is contested. From that, it's a single community. But the U.S. has this founding myth. Australia doesn't quite have the same. I mean, yes, there was the first fleet that arrived in Australia, but there's not the same independence movement from the UK. Australian independence was a gradual accreting of more and more autonomy within the borders of Australia that really, even as late as the 1970s, there were elements of latent British influence. And for that matter, today, the Queen and now King Charles III still is on the money of Australia, right? So in Australia, the history wars and the prioritization of Indigenous history in many ways is like a declaration of independence. It's Australia's intellectual elite trying to separate itself from a British intellectual heritage to say, no, we have our own history. It's this Indigenous history of Australia. And Australia is not the first country to do that. I mean, in Taiwan, depending on who's elected in power in Taiwan, history books flip-flop from KMT in power, Kuomintang. Taiwan's history goes back to ancient China. DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party, wins an election. No. Taiwan's history is the indigenous settlement of this island, right? And the various immigrants, including Chinese immigrants, who've together formed Taiwan identity. Which Taiwan do you want? Well, of course, both Taiwans are true. Which one you want is a matter of defining what the democratic community is. Is it a democratic community of a Chinese settler colonialism that integrated native Taiwan people, or is it a community of people in Taiwan who then were influenced by settler Chinese? Same for Australia. We can have these debates endlessly, but the teaching of history is, in the end, about nation building. It's about creating an agreed identity for the country. And as ideas of the nation change, the teaching of history changes with it.
See, you put many different points, and really I like those. You expanded our discussion now. So if you look at and coming back to my favorite topic, and I think yours also, the history. Now, if you look at the narratives nowadays, and social media is helping many of the indigenous voices to come up. And there are people who are also studying Australia as much as Australians or Europeans have studied India or China or US. Now, a new group of scholars are coming in who are actually studying the history of European lands, European invasion stories, and cross-verifying that, okay, what you did over there and how you came here. Like the Vasco da Gama story is a Gujarati trader bringing Vasco da Gama to the shores of India. Now they're studying that European discovery period is not world discovery period, because Native Americans say we were already here. What did you discover? Sure. So this kind of opposition, or I won't say opposition, it's kind of a my narrative also is important. Like indigenous communities are saying that our narrative is also important. We should be taught in the campuses. So in your experience in Australia and academic world, how far those views, because I see a scholarly consensus in the campuses, academic world, keeps out the views of the other communities, They say, this is the course we have created. You have to learn our way, and then you can be assimilated. So how do you think the scholarly consensus will work when people who are outside that consensus are
Yeah.
questioning the subject matter of that consensus?
I think scholars should be more forthright in admitting that the formation of a consensus around history is itself a political act, and that they are committing political acts just as much as those who oppose them are doing so. Because history can be seen from either perspective. Look, to give an example that'll be familiar to Indians, you casually mentioned earlier that the Mahabharata and the Ramayana are the epics of India, and I think you implied the indigenous people of India. I don't know if you used the word, but there's certainly a strong element in Indian popular culture today insisting that the Sanskrit language and these great Sanskrit epics are the indigenous culture of India, opposing the hegemonic theory, if you go to any academic conference, which is the Indo-European invasion theory, that Indo-Europeans originated on the steppes of Central Asia, invaded India at some point approximately 3,000 years ago, and then conquered the country in stages and spread their culture and language throughout the country. We'll never know which theory is right. But it almost doesn't matter which theory is right, because the point of it doesn't matter from a sociological and political perspective, because the purpose of the theory is not to be correct. The purpose of the theory is to assert a certain form of national identity for the country. With indigenous issues, and right now indigeneity is very popular, imperialism is on the way out, and so everyone wants to claim to be indigenous. So whether it's Egypt embracing the pyramids over its Muslim heritage, because of course the Muslim heritage only dates to the 7th, 8th century. Pyramids were there much earlier, but the pyramids were built, of course, by people who have, in an institutional sense, nothing in common. None of the ancient institutions of Egypt survive into the present day. But on the other hand, it's a great brand for Egypt, and people are very proud of it. And fine, there's no problem with that. But we should accept that in every country we look at, Egypt, India, United States, Australia, we're creating a standard history to support a nation-building effort that is important for democracy. That may rile people up because they're very emotionally committed to the histories that they peddle, but there may be a truth out there, but we have no way to know what the truth is. And I stress, from a practical standpoint, it almost doesn't matter what the truth is. The truth is of academic interest. It's not really of political interest. What's of political interest is how people want to identify to form a community that is a democratic community in which we gracefully accept losing an election, but still remaining within the community, not forming a rebellion, not trying to overthrow the government, but just accepting that because we are together in a community of shared destiny, we'll wait till the next election and vote next time.
So this kind of mindset, like where we are creating a national identity. Like I have written 4 books on Ramayana and Mahabharata and the geographical spread, and I've verified, and through videos, many of the videos are on the channel. People can watch it if they're there. You can check on the videos there, where Ramayana mentions a place in Peru. So every mountain in the world has a name given in Ramayana. It shows that the people during that time also knew about the earth very well. And in Mahabharata, the same, Mahabharata is written after Ramayana. And these are very ancient texts with accurate geographical information, very accurate. Which mountain is where, which ocean is there. It debunks everything which came up during the 17th century of European Enlightenment. That's where.
But you're surely aware that most credentialed university scholars will disagree with you.
Absolutely. That's what we challenge over there, because because those credentials itself is a problem. See, the people may say they may got a PhD or something else, but it doesn't. See, I'm a computer science guy, and we are doing the history because I see that the history has been severely destroyed. Like I give you an example, Native American culture, many of the chiefs, they present the view of Amerique. It's not so. Europeans say or Americans say it came from Amerigo Vespucci. That was the guy, Portuguese guy. But the Native Americans say there was a queen named Amerique of the Ojibwa tribes, which is in Canada and northeastern United States. And Ojibwa tribe had a princess named Amerique, Amerique, they write it over there. And from there it came. So there is two versions, right?
It is a bizarre and curious historical fact that something that happened so recently, we actually don't know the origin for certain
exactly
of the name. It is quite bizarre. But
my question to some of the professors here, departments of history, was, why didn't you consider that version? Why did you consider the Portuguese version? What was the reason for that? Now there is no answer to that. There is no answer. And like you said, there is an ambiguity over there, or ambiguity is maintained. And now these people, if they want to go and teach history, now coming to the example of India back, India as a country has existed for a very long time. From today's Iran, and you quoted Southeast Asia, everywhere has Indian influence, including Indonesia, has a very strong influence, Indian influence. But the history books do not reflect the changing world, because people are researching, people are for giving their views. Like one of our channels exists, this channel is also doing the same thing, is that we are sharing, we are researching, and we are proving that the academics are wrong. So the academic intellectual,
proving is probably too strong a word. Providing evidence that they're wrong. But look, I'm sorry to push back, but we see these conflicts are not limited to India. I mean, anyone who follows BBC history will see that there are massive conflicts in the UK. Is England a Celtic country or an Anglo-Saxon country? And really, of course, it's like it's both and neither, and everything. But archaeologists and professional academic archaeologists and historians end up being very committed to trying to promote one view or another. Or the latest thing is the idea that Anglo-Saxons were peaceful settlers in the UK, and because most academics in the UK today are pro-immigration, they try to spin the narrative of Anglo-Saxon settlement of the UK as the accommodation of visitors from another country. And it's like, no, they killed all the men and raped all the women. Just read the contemporary accounts. But it's so politicized because people want to use, not just people, professional historians want to use history to support their own preferred national identity. That it really becomes to some extent, a bit of a circus, but I don't want to ridicule it because I take it very seriously. I think the debates you're having, the debates people are having in the UK, are very important for the formation of national consciousness. And whether or not you're right, and I don't know whether or not you're right about the Mahabharata. I don't read Sanskrit. I've never even read the whole thing in English. I've only read summaries in English. I have no idea whether or not you're right. For me, as a sociologist, the important thing is that you are presenting an approach to Indian history that has implications for how India unites as a nation today. Whether it's true or not, I have no idea, and I would assert even you have no real idea. You may have evidence, but you can't know for sure.
So I go by the text when I go, and I can read Sanskrit and I can translate it also. And when I see the European version of translations, they're very pathetic. Even though they try to say that we know Sanskrit very well, like the Max Muir's translations are atrocious. Because I
take your word for it. I have no reason to dispute you, but I have written about the strange similarities between the Mahabharata and the Ramayana and the Iliad and the Odyssey in ancient Greece. I don't read ancient Greek either. But the stories have such striking similarities, that to me they both must come from a common root. We know the languages come from a common root. Now, whether those people came from India and went to Europe, whether those people the current dominant theory came from what's now Ukraine and went to both India and Europe. It's fun to speculate on. but it's not really important from the standpoint of contemporary historical politics, because whether or not you're right, and whether or not academics agree that you're right, your narrative still has important use value in Indian nation formation.
True. I mean, see, that ambiguity itself is going to be there. Ambiguity will be there because everyone, like you said, is interested in their identity, and they don't want their identity to come from somewhere else. That's a problem of the nation states kind of mindset, which is a European mindset. Now, coming to the Aryan invasion theory, we know that it has been debunked very conclusively in India, at least, and there are more people that are talking about it. Now, changing the topics. Now,
Sure.
when we say, and I'm loving this discussion. I can go hours. I know you have a time limit, and we also have a time limit. So there is what is the influence of Vatican in, like you mentioned, Anglo-Saxon, Celtic, Germanic tribes, Franco tribes. There are many of these tribes were there who were actually natives of Europe before anything happened. Greeks and Romans were Greeks were the original, and then Romans, and so many communities were there, right from Turkey to all the way to UK. Similar culture, very similar culture. Now, coming to the role of Vatican in the world history. Now, we all know that how the papal bulls divided the Atlantic into east and west, and then Portuguese were given the east side and the Spaniards were given the west side. And that's how the colonization of South America started. Some of the pet topic of my students here, because many of them from South America. So so when we look at the role of Vatican in colonization and also creating one view of history, of homogenizing, because it's easier to rule with homogenization. Again, a political motive there. What is your view on that?
Look, I think the role of the Vatican is dramatically overstated. I think the division of the world between the division of the non-Western world between Portugal and Spain was an accomplished fact, and the Vatican simply stepped in to try to help prevent conflict between two important Catholic powers of the time. Which is to say, Portugal had already run into Brazil at that point. Spain had already run into Mexico and the Americas. And crucially, Portugal was already sending ships, and Portugal had a monopoly on the geographical technology to be able to send ships to India. So Portugal was already expanding in the Indian Ocean. And in fact, if you look carefully, the Philippines, which was colonized by Spain, was not technically on the Spanish side of the world. And for a while, the Spanish tried to produce maps that showed the Philippines being far, far further east than they really are, just so they could technically say they were in compliance with the papal agreement. But really, I think the Vatican has not been an important force in geopolitics really since the 16th century, and even a little earlier. I mean, probably not since the late 15th century. That said, certainly Roman Catholicism played an important role in colonization. In some cases, it was a very positive role in the sense that it was the Catholic Church that in the initial days of the Spanish and Portuguese settlement of what became the Americas, it was the Catholic Church that pushed against slavery, right? Because the Catholic Church did not allow slavery. It was a long-standing medieval Catholic reform to outlaw slavery, first in the Roman world and then in the Americas. Now, of course, later on, the importation of African slaves to the Americas put paid to that. But the Catholic Church has, I think, been a creature of its times throughout history. And it's easy to criticize an organization that's been around for 2,000 years because, our own views have changed in the same way that, we can criticize Planned Parenthood for doing things that we would today think are monstrously illiberal. Yet Planned Parenthood represented the best liberal thinking of the 1920s. So was it liberal then? Yes, it was. It's just that liberals had a different point of view. So yeah, I mean, the Catholic Church mainly exists, let's always remember, as an organization of its members. That is, it's an organization of Catholics. And I think you can hold it accountable to the welfare and ultimately to the spiritual welfare of Catholics, since within their own internal logic, the purpose of a church is not even to promote the material well-being of its parishioners, it's to promote the spiritual well-being of its parishioners. If you embrace the spiritual precepts of the Catholic Church, then you can criticize it on the whenever it's fallen short of those spiritual precepts. Of course, if you're not a Catholic, and I'm not, my personal background is half Italian and half Greek. I was baptized Catholic, but I'm not a practicing Catholic, and I've never been confirmed as a Catholic. So I'm not a Christian believer. So for me, I don't accept the principle that the principles on which the Catholic Church operates. I respect them, but I don't use them as my own principles because I'm not a Catholic. It's that simple.
I travel a lot all over the world, and I was in Africa, and I went to one Tanzania village, and beautiful village. And I must tell all the viewers who are watching this show must visit Tanzania inside and go to Kilimanjaro and other mountains over there. Beautiful, beautiful landscapes. The one thing I noticed with the locals over there, they are respectful to sun, they're respectful to moon, like common cultures all over the world. Native American, South American native culture, India, common native culture, worshipping sun, worshipping moon, respecting the nature, environmentally friendly, good, great values. Now, here comes a guy with a book. This is a book. You guys, if you don't follow, you're not civilized. And so one native over there in Tanzania told me that we respect the sun, moon. Do you respect them? He asked them. He told me the story. He was telling me the story of what happened to him when the preachers of Catholic Church came over there. And he said, and Africans have realized one thing, and the very famous quote of Desmond Tutu, earlier we had the land, they had the Bible, now we have the Bible, they have the land. Same story in South America. Same story happening in India, some parts, in Kerala and other places where lands have been acquired and the locals have been pushed. Like Northeast India also is experiencing that. So there is a general resentment against homogenization based on religion. And it's also very disrespectful now that you are not civilized, I have come to civilize you. Now that is now being spoken openly in the social media and other places, that these academics are carrying out the work of the Vatican of further colonization by adopting science, calling them we are scientific, and because science is the new religion nowadays in the West. Every politician you can say, do you believe in science? Then you are a problem. So what is your view on this?
So first, when Desmond Tutu said, now we have the Bible, he wasn't disparaging the Bible. After all, Desmond Tutu was an Anglican archbishop.
Exactly.
Yes, and I'm certain that he believed in God and believed in the Bible. Look, if you believe, if you are one of those people who believe that anyone who does not accept your faith or does not share your faith is doomed to eternal damnation, eternal suffering, I can understand that you would feel you have a duty to share your faith with as many people as possible. I may not share that faith, but I respect people who have the conviction of their faith that they want to spread it. Now, in a democracy and in democratic countries, we have to accept that there are people of many different faiths who each of them believe they have the answer to eternal salvation. And so we try to evolve mechanisms that let people compete for souls in a peaceful way without causing too much resentment for other people. And that causes a lot of tension. There are issues around that. I understand it's not easy to solve that. But I don't see the Vatican as having any particularly unique role in colonialism. Of course, Protestant countries were colonialists too. Countries seem to colonize where they had the power to do so, regardless of their faith. And that applies to Catholics, Protestants, Muslims, people of any faith, Chinese, I'm not sure how Southeast Asia became Hindu. When it became Hindu, we don't have the historical records. Was it simply that way from time immemorial, or was there some process of colonization that had occurred, of the spread of Indic civilization from its center in India to outlying areas in Southeast Asia? Well, the fact that we don't have the records of that process doesn't mean the process didn't occur. I strongly suspect that it did occur. Colonization is it is a violent process that was of its time. It's certainly not going to happen in a literal sense anymore. But when you do suggest that there has been a neo-colonial approach associated with specifically Western concepts of civilization, I think there's a kernel of truth in what you're saying. I think there is a very strong moral, I would say, in my own writing, I've said a Calvinistic ideology of the spread of establishment liberalism, and the idea that what the Anglo-American liberal establishment currently believes, whatever that is, has to be accepted by the rest of the world, or the rest of the world is not civilized. Now, the irony is that while an older Anglo-American establishment is still trying to spread Christianity in Africa, with the implication that people will be more civilized if they accept Christianity, the newer Anglo-American establishment is very much opposed to that. And so, in a strange way, what we have are these battles in the West, and particularly in America, these battles between a conservative establishment that wants to promote missionary work in Africa and a newer, more postmodern liberal establishment in the United States that wants to promote family planning, that wants to promote very specific forms of education, of gender theory, that certainly wants to promote respect for not just all human rights, but very specifically respect for the human rights of homosexuals. That is also a kind of neocolonialism. I think it's motivated by the same sort of missionary zeal that motivates actual missionaries, but it's very, it's. I don't want to pass moral judgment on it. Of course, personally, I want to see greater human rights for homosexuals in Africa. Now, do I agree with the neocolonial framework in which those rights are pushed on sometimes reluctant societies? Well, I don't always agree with the methods. That say, I thoroughly agree with the goals. That is, if there are societies that would be intolerant of homosexuality and go so far even as to commit violence and, in ultimate cases, murder and judicial murder, as much of Africa, as much of the Middle East, the Muslim Middle East, as we've just seen in Indonesia with the new criminal law in Indonesia. Yeah, I would like to see that changed. And yes, I would view it personally as a civilizing mission to go to people in those countries and say, really, it's not civilized to do what you're doing. So I'm part of this neocolonial civilizing mission. So while on the one hand, I acknowledge that it is neocolonial, it is wrapped up with very disreputable today terms of a civilizing mission. Nonetheless, I agree with it.
See, most of the traditional cultures, if you study the native cultures of all over the world, most of the traditional cultures never had any even discussion about homosexuality, ever. And it was considered part of the society. Nobody thought about it. Like if you ask a Native American chief about what was the condition of homosexuals, because homosexuals were there.
Yeah, I think to some degree that's a romanticization. I mean, we have a lot of it, whether it's homosexuality or extreme violence, sexual violence, or violence against women, or extreme violence against honor killings. I don't want to speak for every indigenous society, but many indigenous societies have had these aspects. That is the indigenous wonderland of peaceful societies that where everyone was always supportive and wonderful to each other. I'm very skeptical that wherever we don't have records I'm told this is the way it was. But wherever we do have records, it was much more violent and vicious. So I'm suspicious of selective memory in these cases.
So there are two civilizations who have maintained very strong records, documentary records. One is the Indic civilization from India. They have very solid documentation of all the histories. Whether they're taught in the universities or not, that is a different matter altogether. But there is a parallel world existing in India and other places,
Sure.
which have very strong documentary, like the Vedas, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, Upanishads. They have very strong documentation, probably more
Sure.
documentation than even European
But
documentation.
there's several. India, China, the Muslim world, of course, the Western world. There aren't just two. There are multiple civilizations that have strong historical records. But indigenous civilizations, almost by definition, tend not to.
Mostly oral. Like for example,
Yeah.
Native Americans are oral and pictorial, and South Americans have the same thing, oral, pictorial. But the documentation was still there in their version. Like for example, now in Mexico City, there is a new department. Now Mexico in 2013 recognized 63 official languages and 263 different dialects. They recognized it. Now, so there is a movement in South American countries and other countries to bring forth the indigenous languages, indigenous cultures, and things like that. Not happening in the US, not happening in the Europe as well. Europe has largely not documented the traditional Romani culture, not documented these traditional Celtics. So there's a lot of documentation existing, like Vikings. Vikings has been romanticized in the movies. I'm not talking about that.
Yeah, look, I've gone on record, and I recently published an article in Quadrant magazine about the idea that the liberal intellectual establishment only has room for three causes at a time. And Native Americans haven't made it in the U.S. because in the U.S., the three causes right now are global warming, transsexuality, and black, race issues. And you'd have to knock off race in order for Native Americans to get in, versus in Australia, where they're very small African recent immigrant populations, and there's no history of slavery. The three issues are transsexuality, global warming, and indigeneity. And so indigeneity has become a big issue, just like indigeneity has become a much bigger issue in Canada than it has in the US, and there's much greater recognition in Canada. But I really want to push back though on back on the issue of the civilizing mission. Look, I'm very opposed to hypocrisy, and a lot of my writing, especially my popular social science writing, has focused on exposing hypocrisy. And while it's very easy to say, we're opposed to neocolonialism, and we're opposed to the Westerners imposing their ideas in the rest of the world, and we're opposed to American imperialism in Africa and the Middle East, then you say, oh, so this Afghan girl is going to be kept in her home for 14 years and then be given to a man as a bride and have no choice in that. And then all of a sudden it's like, no, we want to stop that. It's like, well, wait a minute. Do you believe in the civilizing mission, or do you accept that, all peoples have their own ways that we must respect and admire? And the truth is, most intellectuals would like to think of themselves as respecting the ways of others. And I think I go much farther in a real way towards studying and respecting multiple cultures around the world and trying to understand them on their own terms than most other academics, most other social scientists do. But at least I recognize that, no, but I'm still an imperialist. No, I don't want to invade countries. I know, but I very much want to stop. I very much want, liberty for Afghan and Iranian women. I very much want to end the sexual assaults in remote indigenous communities in Australia. And, even if that means imposing my own hegemonic liberal viewpoint of civilization against what I consider to be uncivilized practices. And I'm going to use the term unabashedly. I consider it uncivilized to have the practice that you can rape a woman because she's your property. I consider it uncivilized that girls should not be educated. I do consider these things uncivilized, and I'm happy to be a voice for civilization, even in a world where calling for civilization and associating Western Anglo-American liberalism with civilization. In academia, this has become, a forbidden thing to do. I don't want to be a hypocrite. I do accept this civilizing mission, and I believe in it.
So in a very traditional concept, if you look at it, then what you're saying, I respect what you're saying, and that's what we are doing also through these kind of shows. We are bringing forth the points which cannot be discussed in a normal academic environment, because here you get a choice of using your freedom of expression and talk about it. One thing comes to the mind when it comes to the civilizing missions. Now, if I go back to, I'm a student of ancient history, and I base my studies based on Ramayana, Mahabharata, and then expand on it. That's my viewpoint from where I come from. In the Western world, I'm saying the West means probably the people who are economically stronger countries. That is the West today, which is USA, UK, Germany to some extent, but still Germany is an ally. It's not they don't have as much freedom as UK has. So coming to a Western viewpoint versus an Asian viewpoint, because if you look at the economic powerhouses, economies drive civilizations. Whosoever has more economic wealth by any ways. I mean, Europeans looted a lot of nations and they got a lot of wealth from there. Like I recorded 60,000 tons of gold was taken from Aztecs, which is Tenochtitlan in near Mexico City.
Sure.
So, but the wealth is now moving towards Asia. Asia has always been a target of colonization for money purposes, whether it's any part of Asia. So now its wealth is moving back there. Populations are there. Almost, if you just combine US, India and China, is almost like 3 billion people. We're talking about approximately, with all the Asian countries involved, 3 billion people. Now, automatically, the purchasing power of that region has always been historically higher than South America or any other continent. The fight is going to go. So now, when those economic powerhouses come up and they start putting their version of history and start completely dissociating themselves with anything which the Europeans ever wrote or prophesized or philosophized or any such thing. So what do you think the world condition will look like?
So first, I don't think it's going to happen. While there are many outsider intellectuals, and forgive me, I would count you among the group of outsider intellectuals, meaning that even though you're teaching to university students, you're not the professor of history or professor of Asian studies at Stanford University. Okay, so that, at least my understanding is you don't have that appointment. It's outsider intellectuals who are driving these narratives, while the insider intellectuals, that is, those who hold appointments at major Indian universities, for the most part, are integrated into global, Anglo-American university networks. Right? So the writing of history, even in India, the writing of popular history, may challenge these hegemonic narratives. At the same time, the hegemonic narrative, even within India, hegemonic, not necessarily most popular, not necessarily selling the most books, not necessarily attracting the most viewers on YouTube, but the hegemonic narrative that controls the institutions is a narrative that, for the most part, is aligned with the Anglo-American academy. And we see the same even in China. And I say even in China because in China, uniquely, the state has put its weight behind a revisionist approach to history that challenges hegemonic Western narratives. And even in China, my impression is that within China, those state-sponsored academics who challenge the hegemonic narrative are not really taken that seriously by the remaining academics who would much rather integrate into Anglo-American networks. It's certainly the same case in Russia, where, again, there's state support for revisionist narrative. So I don't think that the rise of Asia is going to substantially change the narrative, because Asia is, for the most part, elite Asia at least, is buying into Anglo-American networks. I wrote a book on this a few years ago called American Tianxia. It was primarily focused on China, not on India. But the thesis essentially was that whatever is happening politically between the U.S. and China, culturally and in terms of social networks, Chinese social networks are at the elite level are integrating into American-centered networks. Thus, the Chinese Tianxia, all under heaven, the Chinese world, instead of being a new world with China at the center, was instead a world in which the US was at the center and China was peripheral to that. And I think that same pattern is being replicated in India. And with India being an open society as opposed to China as a closed society, I think it's even more likely that in India, the India at the center narrative will remain a very popular, very influential outsider intellectual narrative. I doubt it will become the dominant intellectual narrative. Now, I may be wrong. It's a mug's game to predict the future, but my own bet is that the power of social networks is stronger than the power of numbers or even money.
Good point. Now, if I look at the endowment fund of American universities today, stands at around $700 billion total, American campuses.
Okay.
And which is a lot of money. Just Harvard alone has $77 billion of endowment funds. Just Harvard.
Yeah.
Other campuses much equal or much more, I don't know. But total is around $1 trillion, 780 to...
Okay, yeah.
Now the Indian corporations are rising, and Indian corporations are also investing in education also. Like you must have seen that many of the new
yes.
researches are being sponsored by the Indian corporations, presenting an Indic viewpoint. Now, academic narrative is built on the power of funding, whether it's a political funding or corporate funding. American funding is mostly corporate funding, combined with the religious sentiments like Protestants or Catholic, like they will sponsor their own, like Jewish group sponsors the Jewish study groups all over the United States. And Chinese are doing Confucius now in USA. Now, when this happens, don't you think that the current environmental setup, which is Anglo-American, which you very honestly said it, this is absolutely true, is going to be challenged? Because now there has to be a room for people of the land, there has to be room for other cultures, and there has to be room because 300 million, a country of 300 million people, or combined Europe and US combined, if you make it, is 600 million people, 700 million people, cannot define the narrative of the world, which is 7.8 billion people. What is your view on that?
Yeah, cannot and should not are two different things. So if we look at these new prominent Indian universities being funded by Indian billionaires, the Ashoka universities, O.P. Jindal University, Azim Premji University, they are not adopting an Indic, specifically Indic point of view. Their ambition, from everything I can tell, is to climb in the Western rankings by hiring people who have US and UK PhDs to publish in mainstream Western journals. That is, they are tools of what I've called in another work, like I said, of the American Tianxia. They're tools of American world society formation. They're not countering this narrative. Similarly, many Indian billionaires want to purchase a degree of respectability by donating to institutions like Stanford and Harvard. I mean, my microphone here is literally sitting on the book I'm currently reading, Snakes in the Ganga, by Dr. Rajiv Malhotra. And, he documents a lot of these very processes. Well, so I'm not denying the rise of India. I'm very keen to observe the rise of India. And I'm very interested in the rise of Indic perspectives. But just as I was interested in the rise of Sinocentric perspectives, just as I co-authored a book essentially on the rise of Latin American indigenous perspectives. I mean, I've been very interested in these in outsider approaches to outsider approaches to worlding. to the creation or understanding of how the world is shaped. I've written quite a bit on Russian Eurasianism and Alexander Dugin and his approaches. I'm aware of these various movements. I respect them. I don't agree with them. Respect and agreement are two very different things. I respect them. I'm very interested in them from an academic perspective as a sociologist who spent a lot of time studying globalization. But I don't think they'll succeed. I think they will remain as secondary perspectives, not only in the global stage, but as secondary perspectives in their own countries. I'm not saying that should happen. That's not my wish for you. That is my prognosis.
Absolutely. I mean, you have a right for doing that. You're giving your own views on that. So, this is the last question, and then we'll wrap up this show. And I'm loving this discussion with you. So, one of the things which really comes in you correctly said that the most of the Indian corporations are investing in American universities, and most of the endowment funds are given by the Indian corporations actually, and Indian wealthy individuals. They are also doing the same thing now, and whether that changes or not, we don't know. Like you correctly said, I cannot predict things, and I'm not a monk in any way to predict those things. But there is like I said earlier, that when the wealth moves, the wealth drives a lot of things, because most of the academic research and narratives are built with money. Earlier, it used to be the kings used to spend the money. Now it's the corporations who spend the money. That's the difference it has come in. Now, if you look at the world today, the secular word in the American Constitution means keeping the church out of the American political landscape. And personally, people can follow any religion they want, but the state doesn't have a religion there. Now, if you look at from the academic perspective, in countries which are purely running on religious purposes, and what is the academic freedom according to you in those countries? Because those countries tend to mix up things over there, and the untold violence on women and children happen over there in the name of faith. So what is the role of academics over there, global academics? Because those people are also tying to the Western universities. Like most of the universities in those countries are tie up with the American, get a validation from Harvard or Stanford.
Some of them are actually branch campuses. NYU Abu Dhabi, yes. NYU Shanghai. Yeah,
absolutely. Yes. So what is your view on that?
Look, academic freedom is simply not a reality in non-democratic countries. Flat out, that's the case. Some non-democratic countries allow greater scope, some allow lesser scope, but ultimately everyone is aware that there are barriers on what they can study. Now, the same is true in democratic countries. I mean, there are barriers to academic freedom in Australia. I'm personally aware of 3 academics who have been fired in Australia for their views. 2 of those cases became national news and resulted in high court decisions. So academic freedom is not absolute anywhere. But in Australia and the United States, it has far greater, incomparably greater latitude than in Saudi Arabia, in China, in Iran. Right. So there are always limits, but the limits in the free world are far broader than the limits in theocratic or other repressive states. Nonetheless, these repressive states have wanted the prestige of having Western-style institutions, and so they do allow much greater latitude than you would expect. Even in Russia, there are a small number of privileged institutions that harbor critical scholars and that are tolerated as part of the country's attempts to modernize its academy. So even in those countries, there's some degree of latitude. But, let's face it, it's democracies where you have academic freedom. And in that, I very much include India. I don't know if you want to go into the indices rating India ridiculously low on academic freedom, but it is something ridiculous. I haven't studied academic freedom in India, but I have read the studies of academic freedom in India. And the worst allegations of limits of academic and freedom in India come down to cases around the ability of academics to protest outside their academic career, or cases of defamation. But we don't see mass firings of academics in India due to their viewpoints, in a country where many academics take very critical viewpoints and are not shy to do so. So, all democracies tend to have very good academic freedom, never absolute, but it's much better than in non-democracies.
Yeah, we'll cover that in another show, because that will be a topic on just the academic freedom. We can do that. But I must tell you that University of Moscow and University of Cairo has one of the best history departments in the world. And I've been there personally, and the kind of information I could take out, which will be completely contrasting to anything which American universities teach. Mm-hmm. And also even the British universities have that record. It's better than Oxford and Cambridge any day. So
better or worse, I have a lot. I want to emphasize, I have a lot of respect for non-Western perspectives. And when I say that, I'm very dismayed that many of my colleagues seem to limit their respect for non-Western perspectives to non-Western academics who write in English and attend Western conferences. And so essentially only non-Western people, as long as they don't adopt non-Western perspectives. I've been really very interested in studying non-Western perspectives comparatively. And I mentioned earlier, that I've myself worked in serious ways on indigenous Latin American perspectives, indigenous Chinese perspectives, indigenous Eurasianist Russian perspectives. I gave 2 short courses at Moscow State University myself in the past when times were more peaceful. And now I've been studying indigenous Indian perspectives. And while I'm not myself a non-Western person, I'm clearly an American intellectual. And while I don't agree with really any of these perspectives that I've studied, that is, they're not my perspective, I haven't adopted them, I haven't become a non-Western person, I have a lot of respect for them. There's a lot of very serious scholarship, there's a lot of deep knowledge, and I have a lot to learn from them. And I'm very, the reason I've studied them is that I want to learn.
I think that is true with all intelligent people, because intelligent people like to keep an open mind. And that's the real test of scholarship, where you keep an open mind. In fact, you'll be surprised that most of the academic research in the US is done by non-Western people, non-European people. And they are the ones who are writing papers, many of them, majority of them.
Sure.
And same in Moscow. Moscow University had people from Middle East and other places, not necessarily from Russia. Right. They were all there as scholars over there. But eventually, a time will come where both sides of academic, whether it is outside the campus or inside the campus, have to come together at one point of time and decide what is right. Because ultimately what's going to happen is people are going to say, okay, this is a completely contrasting to what I have read in my indigenous culture, and what they're teaching in the campuses are totally different than what it is. So the global model, at one time, I see that due to social media and various factors, is going to fail one day. Is going to be coming back to the same thing, is that what you believe in your culture and what you want to profess or practice is your culture and your history. And like most of the identities of the South Americans or Indians or Africans are challenged every day, because they don't believe in the Western, what they're being taught over there. And they believe in what they have been taught in their families. So ultimately that some merging has to happen, or a middle.
I don't think it has to resolve. I think the tension is actually very productive. And my own view is that not only is the tension likely to continue, but that it's a good thing for it to continue. I'm very wary of consensus.
Just a parting question. When will scholarly consensus end?
Oh, it hasn't yet begun.
Nice answer. Thank you so much, Salvatore. And thank you very much for coming on the show. And for all the viewers who are watching this show, and this was a completely unedited video, you'll love the discussion. Thank you so much. Namaste.